Could you imagine a world void of any human life, where animals and vegetation roam the earth freely? Well, that was very close to being reality in the 1960s, where humans were nearly the first species to wipe themselves out. Of course, guys, today we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile was a pivotal moment in the history of the Cold War, taking place in October 1962. It was a tense standoff between the US and the Soviet Union over the placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba. The crisis lasted for 13 days and brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a seminal moment in the history of the world, representing the heights of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. It was a key moment in the development of US-Soviet relations and had a lasting impact on the course of the Cold War and modern history. The purpose of this video is to examine the Cuban Missile Crisis, providing an in-depth look at the events that took place, the key players involved, and the impact of the crisis on the world. We aim to give a comprehensive understanding of the pivotal moment in the Cold War and its relevance to the world today. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place during the height of the Cold War, a period of political and military tension between the US and the Soviet Union. The two superpowers were engaged in a struggle for global dominance, each seeking to advance their own interests and ideologies. The US-Soviet relationship was characterized by mistrust, suspicion, and a lack of communication, making the Cuban Missile Crisis a particularly dangerous moment in history. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union began to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, a country located just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Soviet Union saw this as a strategic move to counteract the US's nuclear advantage and to protect Cuba from a potential US invasion. The missile placement was a bold move by the USSR and represented a significant escalation of the Cold War. When the US discovered the missile placement, it responded with alarm and immediately took action to counter the threat. The US imposed a naval blockade of Cuba, effectively cutting off the island from the rest of the world. The US also made demands for the removal of the missiles, setting the stage for a tense standoff between the two superpowers. The US response to the missile placement was a critical moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis and had the potential to escalate into all-out war. The US sought to prevent the Soviet Union from delivering additional missiles to the island and to pressure the USSR to remove the existing missiles. The blockade was a dramatic move, effectively cutting off Cuba from the rest of the world and heightening tension between the US and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis was characterized by a tense standoff between the two superpowers. Both sides were wary of making a misstep that could escalate the situation and bring the world to nuclear war. The US engaged in diplomatic negotiations, but the situation remained highly precarious, with both sides keeping forces on high alert. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. The US and Soviet Union were on the brink of conflict, with the potential for a catastrophic outcome that the world had never seen before. The crisis raised the stakes of the Cold War, putting the world's population in danger and creating a sense of global unease. The events of the Cuban Missile Crisis represented a major turning point in the history of the Cold War and underscored the importance of avoiding a conflict and working towards world peace. One of the key turning points in the Cuban Missile Crisis was the approach of the Soviet ships to the US naval blockade. The US had established a quarantine of Cuba to prevent the delivery of additional missiles, but several Soviet ships carrying missiles approached the US line. This created a dangerous moment, and the US was prepared to use force if necessary to stop the ships. The approaching ships were a test of the US's resolve and represented a critical moment in the crisis. Another turning point in the Cuban Missile Crisis was the great negotiations between the US and the Soviet Union for resolve. The US engaged in intense diplomatic talks, seeking a peaceful resolution to the standoff. The negotiations were difficult, as both sides were wary of making concessions that would be seen as weakness. However, Through a combination of diplomacy and political manoeuvring, the two sides were eventually able to reach a resolution to the crisis. The final turning point in the Cuban Missile Crisis was the actual removal of the missiles from Cuba. The US and Soviet Union reached an agreement under which the Soviet Union would remove the missiles and the US would not invade Cuba. The removal of missiles marked the end of the crisis and signalled a return to a relatively stable US-Soviet relationship. The successful resolution was seen as a victory for diplomacy and a demonstration of the importance of communication and avoiding conflict. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis saw significant impact on the relationship of the two giants. The crisis demonstrated the danger of nuclear conflict and the importance of diplomatic solutions to international disputes. It also marked a large shift in the US-Soviet relationship, with a greater emphasis placed on reducing tensions and avoiding conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the defining moments of the Cold War. It was a pivotal moment in the history of US-Soviet relations and demonstrated the danger of nuclear weapons. The crisis is still studied and discussed today as a cautionary tale of the dangers of nuclear conflict and the importance of diplomatic solutions. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often seen as a turning point, as it marked a shift towards greater stability and reduced tension between the US and USSR. Today, it is viewed as a reminder of the importance of diplomacy, communication, and the avoidance of conflict. The lessons learnt from the Cuban Missile Crisis are still relevant today and provide an important framework for thinking about how to manage international conflicts and maintain peace. It is a complex and fascinating event that is worth studying for anyone interested in the Cold War history or the history of international relations. For those seeking to learn more about the Cold War, there are many excellent videos on my channel available to provide a deeper dive into the Cold War and its aftermath. By understanding the Cuban Missile Crisis, we can gain important insight into the danger of nuclear conflict and a greater insight into the importance of diplomatic solutions to international disputes. Thank you guys for watching.